it's me, Emily Sanderell again, and I'm back for another video all about women's suffrage. Today, I'm going to be teaching you all about women of color and their work within the movement. The common image of an American suffragist is a middle-class white woman. But while these women did play a big role in the movement, they were far from the only ones fighting for their right to vote. My video today is going to be organized a little different than my past videos. Instead of going chronologically, I'm going to go by category. That way I can give each group of women the attention that they deserve. So let's get started. First, let's talk about Black women in the movement. If you remember all the way back to my first and second video, the first generation of suffragists were also abolitionists. And despite some racist comments said by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony out of frustration when Black men were enfranchised and women were not, many of these early suffragists strongly supported enfranchising Black men and women. In fact, despite their differences, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass remained close friends and supporters of each other's work. Nevertheless, Black women's roles within the movement were often downplayed by white leaders, even when those leaders agreed that Black women should have the vote, because openly supporting Black suffrage meant risking the loss of supporters in southern states. Still, even from the beginning, there were Black voices in the movement. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, both former slaves and prominent abolitionists, both spoke out often about women's rights. Later voices in the movement included women like Mary Church Terrell, who was a leader in the National Association of Colored Women and is known for the quote, "lifting as we climb." And then there's Ida B. Wells, an anti-lynching activist, founding member of the NAACP, and founder of Alpha, the first Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. A favorite story about Ida B. Wells is that during the famous 1913 parade in Washington, D.C., Wells planned to march with her fellow suffragists in the Illinois delegation. But when she got there, she was asked to move to the back of the parade with other Black suffragists. To this, Wells said, "If I can't march with you, then I'm not marching at all." But instead of leave altogether, Wells stuck around and snuck back into the Illinois delegation halfway through the parade because she, quote, "knew it to be just," end quote. While the 19th Amendment did give some Black women living in northern states the ability to vote, Black women living in southern states were still denied the vote through racist Jim Crow laws until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now let's talk about Hispanic women in the movement. Women from this background played pivotal roles, especially in the southwestern United States. For example, Nina Otero Warren was from a wealthy New Mexican family who could trace their heritage all the way back to the days of Spanish colonialism. She helped lead the movement in New Mexico with support from Alice Paul. Her biggest contribution was pushing for suffragist literature to be printed in both English and Spanish so that it could reach a wider audience. Otero also worked to convince New Mexican congressmen to support the 19th Amendment. In Texas, Jovita Oidar was born to a family of Hispanic civil rights activists. She ran a newspaper that actively wrote articles in support of women's suffrage, believing that if women had the vote, they could better fight for Mexican-American civil rights. Similar to Black suffragists, the 19th Amendment did, technically, give Hispanic women the right to vote, but many were prevented from doing so through racist literacy tests and poll taxes that weren't abolished until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Asian American women were also present in the suffrage movement, especially in states like New York and California, where Asian immigrant populations were high. One of the most distinguished Asian American suffragists was Mabel Pinghao Lee, a Chinese immigrant living in New York City. By the age of 16, she was a well-known figure in New York's suffrage movement. In 1912, she helped lead a suffragist parade through the city. When she entered college that same year, she immediately began writing articles and giving public speeches in support of the women's suffrage movement. After women won the 19th Amendment, Mabel Pinghao Lee went on to be the first Chinese woman to get a PhD in economics from Columbia University. And then she continued to advocate for women's access to education for the rest of her life. Despite many Asian American women's important work for the movement, especially in translating literature and giving speeches in their native or familial languages, all Asian Americans were unable to vote until prejudiced immigration acts were overturned in the mid-20th century. These acts prevented individuals of Chinese American ancestry from registering for American citizenship until 1943, and for all other Asian Americans until 1952. And last, but certainly not least, let's talk about Native American women and the suffrage movement. Here's a little-known fact. Many of the first suffragists were inspired to fight for women's rights by observing how the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, treated their women. This Northeastern Federation of Native American tribes was a matriarchy, which meant that their women had the final say in many of the tribe's governing decisions, and that any children that the women had followed them and their families, not their fathers. Seeing this culture caused early suffragists to question how their own patriarchal society treated them. A handful of Native American women were also directly active in the women's suffrage movement, like Sitkala Sa, who was a Yankton Sioux musician and teacher. While Sa is best known for her work fighting for Native American rights with the Society of American Indians, she also supported the women's suffrage movement, often giving speeches that emphasized women's rights. In fact, when she received her high school diploma, she gave a speech about women's issues. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin was a Turtle Mountain Chippewa and lawyer. Baldwin became a nationally known spokeswoman for American Indian women after she spoke before Congress and President Wilson on behalf of the Society of American Indians. In 1913, she joined the famous Women's Suffrage March in Washington, D.C., with the other lawyers who were marching. And when she was interviewed at the event, she educated the interviewer about the traditional political roles of Native American women. Both Sa and Baldwin, like many other women of color, believed that if all women had the vote, then minorities could better advocate for their own rights. In 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, Native Americans were not considered citizens, and therefore could not vote. They would not receive citizenship until 1924. But even then, many states used racist laws to prevent Native Americans from voting until 1963. As you can see, women of all races, ethnicities, and classes found ways to participate in the women's suffrage movement, whether they were welcomed or not. And while the 19th Amendment did not initially enfranchise all American women, it did bring our nation one step closer to full equality for all citizens. When one ceiling is broken, it paves the way for others to demand their rights, and march towards equality in America is far from over. So come back tomorrow to learn what suffrage in America looks like today and what you can do to continue the legacy of our nation's brave suffragists. Until then, we encourage you to head over to our social media pages or check out the description below for more resources and activities to help you keep on celebrating. See you tomorrow!